The next speaker is Sasha Kosovichev. Sasha is a distinguished professor now, I think, in the Department of Physics at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And he's the director of the Center for Computational Heliophysics there. He joined NJIT in 2013, and before that, he was a research scientist at Stanford University. His research interests are helioseismology, dynamo theory, and convection. And I wanted to add something just on a bit of a personal note. A long time ago, feels like a very long time ago, Sasha was my day-to-day advisor when I was a grad student at Stanford. And I think there's an argument to be made that he set me on my current research path all that time ago when he came into my office and showed me a paper from a geophysical journal about computing travel time kernels in the Born approximation. So I wanted to say thanks for bringing that paper by. And today he will talk about helioseismic constraints on the solar dynamo. So thank you, Sasha.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. And thank you for this opportunity to present some results about studying in solar physics. It's one of the most important questions in solar physics, I believe, to understand the solar cycles. When we talk about solar cycles, this probably the best known picture of solar cycles. They measured since Galileo sunspot number, and it shows some variations, including some deep minima. And the puzzle is how we explain this. And some people look at this and some notice that one had a periodicity in variance of the sunspot number. Other people say it's all random, it's just occasionally, and perhaps some combination of variations of long-term activity and some random fluctuations. And we still have no understanding of this picture. So the numbering of sunspot, it started in 1755 from cycle number 1. And currently we're entering cycle 25. And if you look at this picture, you notice that the shape is changing. Shape is not asymmetrical. In particular, it was Waldmeyer many years ago. He noticed that stronger cycles, they have a shorter rise time, and also weaker cycles are longer. So this is one of the features of solar cycles we also want to explain. And the sunspot appears not randomly on the sun. They form a so-called butterfly diagram. And the first, at the beginning of each cycle, that the sunspots start appear at somewhere at mid-latitudes. And then sunspot migration, formation zone migrates towards the equator at the end cycle. So this is 11-year cycle in the butterfly diagram. And also the dynamo theory, it has to explain this. And what's interesting, the sunspots, they also display what's called a Hale polarity law. So there's the sunspots always appear in pairs, bipolar pairs, and the leading spots has opposite polarities in northern and southern hemispheres, and those of polarities are reversing for the next solar cycle. So this picture is from Hale's paper. It's almost 100 years old, and that's also one of the features I want to explain. Also, that during solar minima, 2 consecutive cycles, they may overlap. And this is also, so it's not completely separate, the solar cycles. It's also a picture from Hale's paper. And one important features that also that dynamo theory is needs to explain is so-called Joyce law. And the sunspots appear in pairs, but also that they appear in pairs, and this the pairs of sunspots, that the line connecting these the sunspots, it's inclined towards the equator, and this changes with latitude, this law. Also, there's a lot of fluctuations in this, probably random fluctuations due to emergence and in this law. But there is a tilt, systematic tilt in sunspots. And since 1975, we have measurements of solar magnetic field, and that's all combined pictures of so-called magnetic butterfly diagram. Here it's all magnetograms. They average longitudinally and then stuck together to form this picture. And we can see that this familiar, the butterfly diagram at in sunspot, but in addition, we can see the weaker magnetic field in polar regions. and we can see some transport of magnetic field towards the polar regions and polarity reversals in polar regions. And polarity reversal is also with 11-year cycle. And it was also noticed that magnetic field strength in polar regions during solar minima, it actually predicts the next solar maxima. So this is perhaps our best knowledge about the prediction of solar cycles. So here is a picture that shows that how this prediction is made based on the strength of the polar magnetic field. And we can see here that these crosses that show the estimate, the prediction made at solar minimum, and that's the actual cycle. So it holds pretty well in the past 3 or 4 cycles. And this prediction shows that the next cycle will be similar or weaker than the current cycle. And but you can notice that all this trend, it's on declining trend of solar activity, and that later shows that there's some difference between that rising phase that our dynamo model shows. So what's the current prediction of solar cycle? So this picture from Day Hathaway, it's actually this, you can see this curve, this actual prediction here is made based on Waldmeyer's relation, Waldmeyer's curve was approximated and fitted to the beginning of the solar cycle. So as we see that there is a trend of declining solar activity, if you want to understand. There is a feature that is less known, and that it's usually paid less attention to this. It's so-called extended solar cycle. It was first observed in the emission of green coronal line, and that for many years Dick Altrock measured at Sac Peak the coronal emission, and it forms as a butterfly diagram. But if you look carefully at this picture, it shows that if you look here, that what at the beginning of this cycle 23, but looked like it started much earlier. And first, when it started during the previous solar maximum, and the first feature was some very fast migration towards the poles. So it's called so-called rush to the poles. And then we have an extended solar cycle, 22-year, and including this 11-year cycle when we have the sunspot emergence. And what is interesting is that we also, this extended solar cycle also detected in so-called torsion oscillations. It's zonal flows. Torsion oscillations are not oscillations, it's a historical term that was introduced by Bob Howard, Barry Labonte, when they first detected it on just from Doppler shift measurements on the surface. And here many years of measurements at Mount Wilson, they also stuck together that the variations of flow velocities. Red is higher than average velocity, and blue is slower than average velocity. And here also, apparently they form extended solar cycle, these variations of differential rotation, zonal flows. And so that we talk about the dynamo theory, so that what we need to explain, so we have this big list. First, we need to explain 11-year period of sunspot cycle. We need to explain equator-ward drift of effective latitudes in the butterfly diagram. We need to explain the Hess polarity law and 22-year magnetic cycle. We need to explain Waldmeyer's effect, the Joyce law, and also what the reversal of we need to explain that reversal of a polar magnetic field it happens near the maximum of the sunspot cycles. Also, it's important to explain the correlation between the polar magnetic field strength and the following solar maximum, and also extended solar cycle. It's apparently tells us something important about the solar dynamo. So it's in solar dynamo. There are two basic paradigms in solar dynamo. The first is called flux transport theory, sometimes called the Babcock-Clayton theory. And in this case, the solar cycle is controlled by meridian circulation. Also later he introduced a diffusion. Diffusion played an important role, but it's, for some reason it's now considered this is meridian circulation mostly. So meridian circulation transport, that's what causes the polarity reversals in polar regions when sunspot emerge. and then magnetic field transported to the polar regions and reverse polarity, then transported back to the basic convection zone where it's amplified. And then the butterfly diagram is actually formed by the meridian circulation at the bottom of the convection zone. So then sunspots form there, and they kind of shoot to the surface, and that's how that roughly the theory explains this. And alternative theory, actually it was the first theory, dynamo theory, was suggested by Parker, Gene Parker, and in his theory, the butterfly diagram is produced by dynamo waves. Dynamo waves, it's diffusion waves maintained by the dynamo generation of magnetic field. And but when helioseismology and one of predictions of the theory, the dynamo waves, they propagate along isorotation surfaces. And when helioseismology first measured the differential rotation, then the lines of constant rotation, they're all directed to higher latitudes. So then sunspot should appear somewhere at higher latitudes, and we see there was that you cannot explain migration with rotation rate is along these what is conical lines. But then that helioseismology also discovered subsurface shear layer, and Axel Brandenburg, he first suggested that maybe that in subsurface shear layer, where these lines are directed towards the equator, actually they can turn the direction of the dynamo wave, and it can travel towards the equator. And in fact, we did this modeling with Valery Pipin, and in fact, it's indeed, if you allow toroidal magnetic field penetrate close to the surface, then the superficial layer actually turns the direction of the dynamo waves. So that also was confirmed by other people. And meridian circulation is one of the hottest topic now that in helioseismology, and the reason I just explained, if some measurements show that it may be double cell meridian circulation. If it's double cells, then direction of meridian circulation at the bottom convection zone is towards the poles. So then it will essentially rule out that may complicate it, the flux transport theory. So there's a lot of discussions now about what the structure of the meridian circulation. And in helioseismology, we use basic two techniques. The first is a global helioseismology, that is to measure the frequencies of normal modes, and then from oscillation power spectrum measure differential rotation and its variation. In this technique, you only measure axisymmetrical flows and structure of the sun. And time-distant helioseismology, it can measure the three-dimensional flows, but only in subsurface shear layer, or it can measure meridian circulation, but also azimutally average meridian circulation. So it's based on measuring cross-covariance function and then fitting the travel times. So this technique is actually it was first invented by Tom Duval in helioseismology, and then borrowed by geophysicists, and then they started developing this kernel that Aaron was talking about. And in this case, in simple case, we measure the travel times of acoustic waves between 2 points on the solar surface. And so when we do measurements in different positions and cover the whole area of the sun, then we can actually deconvolve the travel times and determine the sound speed variations and flow variations. So these are simple ray path kernels, and Aaron developed very sophisticated Born kernels that they make more accurate inversion results. So this is what we see, that example, this picture, this movie on the left, that shows that velocity field, this is the divergence of the subsurface velocity field and how it evolves with rotation. So now pipeline at Stanford produces these flow maps every 8 hours, so that's freely available for studying. It's a great source of studying the solar dynamics. So what about torsion oscillations? Torsion oscillations also observed, they measured by global helioseismology and observed in the convection zone. So this picture shows the combination of the variations of differential rotation. It's combined that from two spacecraft, from Soha and Tesla spacecraft for 20 years observations. And here, to similar, like we see on the surface, we can see the extended solar cycle. And it has two branches here. That one branch is it's a migration towards the polar. So it starts somewhere at 60 degrees latitude, migrates to polar regions, and then there is a longer branch. It's migration towards the equator. And one of the puzzles was what this is cycle 24 when it started. And then we don't see the start of the cycle during cycle 25. It should start somewhere here. And then Rachel first noticed that it actually is much weaker and appears below the surface. So it's not very prominent on the surface, but it can be seen below the surface. So just for reference, I showed here that photospheric magnetic field. So then we did a slightly different approach to analyze the torsion oscillations. So we look at zonal acceleration. In general, it's always an advantage when you study any wave phenomenon to look at acceleration, and also it removes the ambiguity when we look at variations of differential rotation. There was always a question what to subtract, how subtract the mean differential rotation, just having that the short time series, how it affects this. So here that's a picture of that one. Of course, when differentiate data, there's noisy data, you have to do some smoothing. So was applied some Gaussian special temporal filters to differentiate these. And the zonal acceleration, it also shows extended solar cycle. So the blue is the deceleration and red is acceleration of the flows. And what was interesting, when we overlay this with magnetic field, it turns out that the zones of deceleration, they coincide with magnetic field regions on the surface, in both in equatorial and polar branches. So this is raises the idea that maybe that if you look at variations of zonal acceleration in the convection zone, we can trace magnetic field. We cannot measure magnetic field directly. The signal is too weak, but maybe just by tracing this acceleration, we can learn about how the magnetic field is evolving in the solar interior. So here it's I'll show this movie in the moment. So this is just a cross section of this cross section of through the this quarter of the sun. You can see here that basically convection zone is a dashed line, and red and blue that show acceleration, deceleration. And so this here it's a polar region, here it's equator. So let me play this movie. So we can see here some kind of wave-like motions. And if you look carefully, you look that you see that the two kind of waves. So that first you can see the strongest signal is somewhere it originates the bottom convection zone at roughly 60 degrees latitude, and then it migrates towards the poles, one branch, and another branch. It takes much longer. It migrates towards the equator. So this again, it raises the idea that maybe that where the solar cycle originates, it's bottom of the convection zone at 60 degrees latitude, where magnetic field it first generated, spaloidal magnetic field. In fact, this was predicted by Parker. It's amazing that when I read his paper in 1955, he actually predicted that solar cycle will start in this region. And to quantify this, also I did local accretion tracking, various version, because movie maybe sometimes not very convincing. But if you do just local accretion tracking, these arrows, it shows the migration of the waves. It's not not flows. And you can see that indeed that two branches that what migrates, that one wave migrates towards the poles, and another towards the equator. And in fact, that we can see that you can start the cycle 24 at the bottom of the convection zone, while cycle 23 it's in process here. That it's a solar maximum here of cycle 23, and cycle 24 it's already starting here in the bottom of the convection zone. So it also to do some further analysis that some methodology here we had to apply principal component analysis actually to trace the dynamo waves to the bottom of the convection zone. And here it's because the data very noisy and also was a systematic error in the data. And it turns out just 3 components of principal component analysis, they describe pretty well that the long-term variations of this zonal flow, zonal acceleration. And here, just for comparison, I show the pictures that were before applying PCA analysis on the left and after applying PCA analysis on the right. And here you can see on the surface identical. And if you go deeper down, then we can see some change here. And in particular, if you look at that 0.75 solar radii, it's a basic convection zone. We can see some, if you don't apply this analysis, you can see some rapid variations, like 2-year variations in magnetic field. And this experimental data. You cannot throw away easily experimental data. So that did some investigation what it could be. And if you look at the radial cuts, then also you can see that before applying principal component analysis, you can see some very complicated behavior at the bottom convection zone. And after filtering, it disappears, of course. And the question was what might cause these variations at the bottom of the convection zone. And it turns out that this was a glitch. That's what we think, that a glitch in global helioseismology data. So when you use helioseismology, it's always a danger of some systematic errors, particularly that also random errors are also significant. It turns out if you plot that what I trace is to fitting of 2 ridges in the spectrum, in the power spectrum of solar oscillations. This is correspond to the modes with radial order 12 and 13. And if you average splitting coefficients of the frequencies for these modes, and then they show some sharp peak. And it's not a single measurement. It was a series of measurements here. And so this is another coefficient that the first coefficient differential rotation that this corresponds to the term which is the power 4 in differential rotation with opposite spike here. And so then we had to do some different analysis. So I asked Sylvain Karženik to repeat this, and his fitting didn't show this. So that's what now we believe that this is actually what's a glitch in data analysis. So then what I was talking about the data is after this applying the principal component analysis to this data. So now we can look at this. It's a picture. It's quite clear, and we can trace the zonal acceleration pattern through the convection zone. Here it shows that time latitude diagrams at various depths, and we can actually trace the origin of this structure that we see on the surface. We can trace to the bottom of the convection zone. The structure, the pattern changes because it's not exactly transport of radial transport of this butterfly diagram from the bottom convection zone. It's more complicated. And here, what's interesting that if you look at different latitudes on the right, then we can see that migration here at the bottom at 60 degrees latitude, it's pretty fast. It takes about 1-2 years for the signal migrate from bottom convection zone to the surface, and it takes much longer if you look at 30 degrees, and then it takes much longer. It takes about 10-11 years, and we can see in the superficial shear layer we can see some kind of slowing down of this of this wave. So this is another interesting observation from this data is that when we look at the signal of cycle 24, the previous solar cycle, and the current cycle, first we can see the cycle 23 and 24, and we can see cycle 24 is weaker here than cycle 23. And if you look at in polar regions, we already see the cycle 25 because it's already started and a few years ago. And in fact, we already see the maximum of these. If you look at the variations of the signal, here on this picture shows the sunspot number in the past two cycles, and the dash curve shows the zone of deceleration at the bottom of the convection zone at 60 degrees latitude. So this minimum, so this acceleration, so the minimum is deceleration. So this minimum corresponds to the cycle 24. And if you go here, then we go here to the next minimum. So this is perhaps this is correspond to the maximum of cycle 25. So in any case, we don't know exact relationship between magnetic field and flow. So this is now that the topic that we are studying, and we don't know that why this how that exactly this weakening of torsion oscillations in cycle in what we see in the global helioseismology will translate into the actually sunspot number. So this is a very interesting question. So if there's a direct relationship, then the next solar cycle will be weaker than the previous cycle. So this is, and then this trend of decline activity will continue. So this is a very interesting question. So now it's about dynamo modeling. So it also it's important to understand this in terms of the modeling. So there are generally three approaches to dynamo modeling. And the first is one that's very popular. There are many codes. It's a 3D and elastic MHD simulations. In this case, it's a fully coupled small-scale turbulence and large-scale dynamics. They describe global dynamics and dynamo process from first principles. But results so far don't match observational data. Probably still not enough resolution or to properly describe the interaction between turbulence and large-scale dynamics. So the second class is what's called Babka-Clayton theory, flux transport theory. This is semi-empirical models that are driven by prescribed differential rotation, meridian circulation, turbulent diffusion, and also introduce a so-called magnetic source function, so that surface magnetic field is taken from observations in this theory. And one of the main goals is to actually to predict the strength of the polar magnetic field, and then use this empirical relation for predicting the next solar cycle. And the particle theory, it's a mean field, fully dynamical theory. It's developed for many years, and in this scale, the difference from the previous, the first theory, direct simulations, is that turbulent and large scales are separated, and small scale and scale interactions described in the form of local and non-local transport coefficients, magnetic diffusivity, kinetic, magnetic helicity, and others. So these are three approaches. So we use this, the last approach, this Valery Pippin here developed this model, and the code, it actually includes everything that what we currently know about interaction between turbulence and large scale in this mean field theory. So it includes that fully dynamical equations. So it actually, it's differential rotation, meridian circulation, not prescribed here. They are modeled here. And so outcome of the models, it's differential rotation and the variations. So it also calculates the torsion oscillations. It calculates the meridian circulation and variations of the solar cycle. Magnetic butterfly diagram, polarity reversals. The model also explains Waldmeier relations. And what's important, what we found recently, it also explains the extended solar cycle. So I just show briefly equations. I don't have time to explain all this, and I show this because sometimes there is opinion that mean field theory is something that's very, very simplified description, and everybody should do direct numerical simulations. But in fact, this is it's a very detailed theory, and developed over the last half century, and it takes into account here that the first equation is it's induction equation, and then E here, it's electromotive force. It's actually that's a mean of turbulence fluctuations, so that U cross B U small and B small, it's fluctuations, turbulent fluctuations of velocity and magnetic field. And this, it creates the mean electromotive force. It's actually the source of generation of dynamo, as was first suggested by Parker. So it also includes diffusion, and the diffusion includes effect of anisotropy, it's rotation and magnetic field. So it's also it's a theory for kinetic helicity. It is called alpha effect. It generates a magnetic field. And here in this theory, just what some people ask what the question about that, what some free parameters. That here that only some 3 or 4 constants are free parameters, like this coefficient Ca. It's a free parameter. It controls the strength of alpha effect, and it controls the strength of the solar cycles. And these all coefficients are order of unity, and prime number is order of unity, the 3/4 here. So what I refer to this YouTube, that when I publish these papers, and astrophysical journals, they have interviews for some papers, and Valery explained in detail each term here. So it's important that also this model includes a balance of magnetic helicity, and the balance of magnetic helicity, it actually provides what's called quenching of dynamo generated magnetic field, dynamical quenching. So it's kind of a back reaction of there's a quenching of back reaction of magnetic field on flows. That what controls the strength of the dynamo, but also that when the dynamo starts, then small k helicity is transformed into large scale helicity, the solar cycle. But there is a balance of helicity. Helicity is conserved here in this equation. And what's interesting that this that if you include this, then it explains the Waldmeister's effect, this dynamical quenching of the alpha effect. And this model also includes the heat transport. It turns out that heat transport is very important. So that heat transport equations that also with all details of turbulence traces and everything. So that everything is included as all this what we know about turbulence as accurate as possible in this theory. In terms of the rotation, medial circulation, it's the momentum equation, it's separated into the azimuthal part and also on the vorticity. So that azimuthal component of the momentum equation describes the differential rotation. And here it's a various driving the tensor, the stress tensor, and also the medial circulation effects, differential rotation and magnetic field. It's all included. And then also, medial circulation is determined from the equation for large scale vorticity. So the coefficients here, that what the question is, how to actually take the turbulent coefficients, and they're taken from standard solar model. So we don't have a better definition so far. So that the turbulent coefficients are taken from the mixing length theory. So here that at the bottom equations show that the thermal eddy thermal conductivity, it depends on this is a mixing length, and it's determined from standard evolution theory. And it also depends on the gradient of entropy, which is calculated, so which is a function of, it's not prescribed. The entropy is calculated in the theory. And G is gravity acceleration, and that's CP. So this is how the model, what equations are solved. So just a few comments about this mean field hydrodynamics. It's actually based on the scale separation here. And in particular, that the idea is that what you calculate the correlation coefficients of these small scale fluctuations, you express these correlation coefficients in terms of large scale properties. And this is done usually that what we use in the Taylor expansion in small scales. And so this is you also use the Taylor expansion, and then you need some closure. That's some closure in this turbulence theory. There's several approaches here, and here that's particular for differential rotation. It's important that in this case it appears so-called non-diffusive flux of angular momentum. So this one calculate correlation of the small scale fluctuations. And then it can be expressed in terms of rotation rate. So this coefficient that appears lambda, so that it's called the lambda effect that controls the differential rotation. So it's called lambda after Lebedinsky, who first developed this theory in 1941. So what's the outcome of this model? So this model, as I said, it calculates differential rotation. And here on this plot on the upper right, you can see the three curves here, red and blue. That's two models here. And the solid line is measurements from HMI measurements. So we can see a pretty good agreement of between the models and observations, that including the superficial layer, so it's slightly less gradient in the model than in the measurements. And here you can see some other parameters. And here what's interesting that we show here the two models. It's one model is with single cell mirror circulation. It's M1 model, and M2 model is with a double cell mirror circulation. So it turns out that the models, it reduces double cell mirror circulation if you take into account variations of the gradient of Rossby number with radius. Or this is equivalent if you take into account variations of the mixing length parameter with radius, then you get a double cell mirror circulation. Also, the secondary cell is extremely weak here in this area. In fact, it cannot be very strong because otherwise the strong mirror circulation in the convection zone, it actually corrupts the differential rotation. It's no longer correspond to the observations. So here's the model. It's a movie that on the left, it shows the variations of magnetic field. The color is a toroidal magnetic field, and lines is a poloidal magnetic field. So we can see the cycles in the convection zone. On the right, this is a zonal acceleration in this model. So we can see similar types. We can see similar types of two branches of waves in the zonal acceleration. So qualitatively, it corresponds quite well to what we see by helioseismology. And as I mentioned, it was important that its model reproduces the extended 22-year pattern of the torsion oscillations. So here we can see that from this model, M1, which is a single mirror circulation cell, that it's, you can see this blue is the deceleration and red is acceleration. And so it reproduces them. And at the bottom, you can see the variations of the toroidal magnetic field. Here, there's nothing in polar regions because it's only toroidal magnetic field which forms the sunspot shown here. So it does explain. So, but what's important that this model allows us to actually to look at what drives the torsion oscillations, investigate what drives torsion oscillations, and also what causes the extended solar cycle. It was established actually a long time ago that torsion oscillations can be driven by a magnetic field. It was first is that Schuster, then Ishimura, then other scientists, they calculated that magnetic field, dynamo generated magnetic field, can drive torsion oscillations. But these theories don't explain the extended solar cycle. And here we calculated all different forces here and look separately at these, and switching on various effects in the model, we can investigate also sensitivity of this effect to various processes. And here that's just for illustration that if you look at how different, I don't have time to explain these, different force components contribute to driving torsion oscillations. And conclusion from these studies was that was completely unexpected. It turns out that the key here is in driving the extended pattern of torsion oscillations. It's magnetic quenching of turbulent thermal conductivity. And it's also there is some change here that how it drives this. So this it changes that entropy gradient, and then it causes the variations of the meridian circulation, and then variations of the meridian circulation, they affect the torsion oscillations and lead to extended solar cycle. So if we remove this effect, then the thermomagnetic tension of on the turbulent conductivity, then we get just a pattern of torsion oscillations like obtained by in many other papers that listed below here. But what is important, also interesting, that this model also makes some predictions about meridian circulation. So it predicts, so it shows the variations of meridian circulation with solar cycle. And it turns out that it can explain that effect that was also found by local helioseismology. They call it convergent flows towards the active regions. And here we can see that in this model, we can see variations of meridian circulation. So the contour lines, these are toroidal magnetic field, and blue and red are variations of the meridian circulation. And so in this case, it corresponds to the flows converging towards the active latitudes. So this was previously, it was in local helioseismology. It was measured as a slow of convergent variation of meridian circulation due to convergent flows towards the active regions. But this model predicts that these variations, they should show the picture of the extended solar cycle of the meridian circulations. And when we look at these variations of meridian circulation using local time distance helioseismology data, and indeed it turns out, so this is a Y component here of the flows, variations of the meridian circulation. It turns out that indeed there are some variations in meridian circulation when there is no magnetic field on the surface. When there is magnetic field, then these are enhanced, so that there are probably two components that some caused by that surface magnetic field or subsurface magnetic field of active regions. And also there is a that component corresponding to solar dynamo, that subsurface solar dynamo. And this was, we did this in a recent paper with Gatling. And then when we found that Rudy Comet also measured this last year, he found that there is variations of meridian circulation even where there's no magnetic field on the surface by using ring diagram analysis. So this is, I think it's very important. That shows that this model has some credibility that we developed. And then I have maybe that a few more minutes that how we can use this on its helioseismology for prediction of solar cycles. Here we develop two models. We still don't know why solar cycles changes, why they're different, change from each other. We look at two models. And first to explain the long-term variations, 100-year variations that correspond to what sometimes it's called the long memory of solar cycles. So when variations of the alpha effect is constant alpha, that they're given with 100-year variations that correspond to some variations, long-term variations of in subsurface turbulence. That we don't know the reason for these, and some rapid variations, like what variations with some scale of solar rotation, and they cause some random variations in solar cycles here. In this, this red is total magnetic flux, and black is dipole moment, magnetic dipole moment of the sun corresponding to polar magnetic field. So we look first these models that we found that these first models, they reproduce what we use now for prediction of solar cycles. So they show that indeed the polar magnetic field measured at the previous solar minimum that correlates with the following solar maximum. And here that we show this blue and red because some difference between the strength of magnetic field, toroidal magnetic field, and the total magnetic flux. So better correlation is found for the total magnetic flux in this prediction. So if you want to predict a solar cycle, then it's better to predict the total magnetic flux during solar cycle, not exactly the maximum. And we look also in the bottom that what previously I claimed that maybe perhaps if we measure torsion oscillations, the bottom convection zone, we predict the next solar cycle. So we look at correlation. So this shows the continuous correlation coefficients between the zonal acceleration at the bottom convection zone and total magnetic flux. And it turns out indeed, if you look at the 0.76 solar radii, bottom convection zone, 60 degrees latitude, then this is the best correlation with time lag of 12 years So we have the prediction of the full solar cycle ahead. And this works better than for these long-term variations and for short-term variations, but it works in both cases. Also, it's much the coefficients it's weaker than we have these random fluctuations. So what now the future? That now the next step it can be generalize this model for 3D. For this, you need to include there's some emergent flux. We don't have theory for emergent flux, so it's some basically ad hoc models. But this in 3D, it can also explain some other features, like that some that Joyce law and variation, particularly magnetic helicity, this hemispheric role of magnetic helicity that is known from observations can be explained, and so that many other features. So in conclusion, so what we can say is that by tracking migration of these zonal flows, stream jets, in the solar convection zone, we can reveal patterns of dynamo waves that control the solar cycle. And heliosmology measurements of the torsional oscillations for 22 years allow us to pin down the location where the solar cycle originates. So it's probably Tachak line, bottom of convection zone, and 60 degrees latitude. And the self-consistent nonlinear mean-field dynamo model explains the extended solar cycle phenomenon. And the extended solar cycle of meridional flows that convergent towards active latitudes is predicted by the models is detected by helioseismology. So the amplitude, also this model shows that the amplitude of torsional oscillation by convection zone during the previous solar maximum correlates with the strength of the following magnetic cycles. Okay, thank you.